There were people that walked across that bridge in Selma, Alabama, that got their heads knocked in. They had horses run them over, all for the right to vote.
50 steps from this building, 600 civil rights supporters linked arms and marched 2 by 2 across the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
We were walking into, people were so disciplined.
The first group was basically grown people, John Lewis, Reverend Reese, and we was in the second group.
From the apex of that bridge, I saw a sea of blue.
Ordered by Governor George Wallace to stop the march, a wall of Alabama state troopers appeared as the marchers crested the bridge.
I'm saying that this is an unlawful assembly.
I don't want to say all hell broke loose,
This march will not continue.
but let's say all hell broke loose.
Peaceful disobedience met government brutality, and the last official barriers to universal suffrage began to crumble. Leading the march was 25-year-old John Lewis.
One day, just listening to the radio, I heard Martin Luther King Jr. speaking, and his words inspired me of saying that things can be better, things can be much better.
The struggle for the right to vote actually began many years before the events in Selma, Alabama. The 800-year-old Iroquois Confederacy embraced peace, equity, justice, and unanimous consent of the governed, but failed to protect the native peoples from the displacement and disenfranchisement that ultimately followed. "90 years after white settlers came to America, the first African slaves arrived at Jamestown in 1619. By 1750, 25% of the million people living in the colonies were African slaves.
The denial of the right to vote did not start in the 19th century, the 20th century. It started from the first moment African Americans were brought here.
Boston, 1770. The killing of runaway slave Crispus Attucks by British soldiers prompted outrage and action. Heralded for his ultimate sacrifice, this revolutionary hero would not have been able to vote for nearly 2 centuries. The Declaration of Independence had a profound impact on the American democracy. Penned primarily by Thomas Jefferson, its promise of equality applied only to white men. George Washington was elected president by white male property owners, the only citizens allowed to vote. Government by the people, by all the people, came only after litigation, legislation, mobilization, and emancipation. From Maine's entry into the Union in 1819 until the Civil War, every new state prohibited free blacks from serving on juries, testifying in trials, and voting. Slaves counted only as 3/5 of a person for allotting representatives. Efforts to end slavery and to allow women to vote shared support.
The world has never yet seen a truly great and virtuous nation, because in the degradation of women, the very fountains of life are poisoned at the source.
And the first American women's movement was born. Sojourner Truth, liberated slave, traveling preacher, abolitionist, and women's rights advocate proclaimed,
if the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back.
By the end of the war, most large southern cities were in ruins, and agriculture was destroyed. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865, but Southern blacks couldn't vote.
Without the vote, his liberty is a mockery. For in fact, if he is not the slave of an individual master, he is the slave of society.
The 14th Amendment gave citizenship to former slaves, but they still couldn't vote.
We'll have our rights, see if we don't. And you can't stop us from them. See if you can. You may hiss as much as you like, but it's coming.
The women's fight continued, but in 1870, the 15th Amendment established a black man's right to cast his ballot. Although 2 black senators, 22 black representatives, and over 700 African-American state legislators were seated in the coming years, force, fraud, and segregation mandated by Jim Crow laws remained. Poll taxes, white primaries, and literacy tests gave corrupt officials broad latitude in systematically disenfranchising blacks.
They didn't say you couldn't vote. They said you gotta be able to pass this test.
I was used for a pawn. They wasn't interested in me voting. They were interested in me keeping somebody else from voting.
They used to ask you questions like, how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap?
You had people failing the voting test that had been to law school.
How many feathers is on a chicken?
Most of the people asking those type of questions, they couldn't hardly read and write.
And since people couldn't pass the test, they couldn't vote.
The Ku Klux Klan used coercion.
And I can remember going with my father.
Fear.
And there was a Klan rally.
Fire.
And I remember them lighting the cross and then moving around the cross.
And lynching. To dominate blacks.
He said, I wanted you to put a face on hate.
November 1st, 1920. Millions of American women cast national ballots, thanks to Mrs. J.L. Byrne of Neoda, Tennessee.
Dear son, hurrah and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I have been watching to see how you stood. but have not noticed anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification. Your mother.
Representative Harry Byrne followed his mother's advice and cast the deciding vote for the 19th Amendment, 41 years after it was first proposed. The 1924 Indian Citizenship Act finally guaranteed Native Americans national voting rights. But New Mexico would wait until 1962, nearly 40 years.
Turn me around, I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land.
A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all. Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right as well as reality.
When you think back to the civil rights era, it truly was an era of innovation with regard to using social tactics, protest tactics, even violent tactics to create social change.
Well, I read in the paper just the other day there were freedom fighters. They are on their way.
The freedom movement of the 1960s began a decade earlier with the Montgomery bus boycott. Mobilized grassroots protesters and telegraphed widespread discontent through an increasingly well-organized leadership.
When Bernard Lafayette and my father and Dr. King and all of them came here, they came here fighting for the right to vote.
Out of some 15,000 eligible blacks, less than 300 were registered, and so we persisted.
My mother used to get off work and go through the project at night trying to teach African Americans how to pass the literacy test.
And then there were lines and lines of black people registering to vote.
Then, years of struggle converged on that bridge in central Alabama.
People from all over the world answered Dr. King's call and came to Selma and marched.
We had a sheriff here named Jim Clark, who one could predict would explode.
Major John Cloud said troopers advance, and you saw these men put it on their gas masks.
These things pop.
I saw blood flowing. Pandemonium broke out in the crowd. It was a state of disbelief. This was happening in these United States of America.
We just wanted, yeah, to be free.
At times, history and fate meet at a single time, in a single place, to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama.
It's an incredible moment. Imagine you go from the government, literally the state government, employing state troopers to beat black marchers who simply want the right to vote, to the point where you have state government, federal troops protecting those very same marchers because of the power of protest.
August 6, 1965. 95 years after the 15th Amendment guaranteed blacks the right to vote, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law.
Voting control everything that we do in a democratic society, from the day we're born until the day we die. It's important that people participate in controlling their own lives, their own affairs. If we won't change, then we must vote. We must participate in the democratic process.
By 2009, the citizens of Selma would be represented by an African-American school superintendent, police chief, mayor, city council majority, state representatives, U.S. congressman, and United States president.